Hi everyone, and thanks for joining us today. It is great to have you back. Today we will be discussing session 10 of this workshop, which means that we are getting pretty close to the end of our time together for now, at least. So this week we'll be doing session 10, and then last but not least is session 11 next week. So I'm super excited to get you started with this one. Today we are going to be discussing qualitative analysis. So where last week we discussed mainly what's the best way to collect qualitative data, today we will be discussing how do we begin to make sense of that. So last week was mostly about interviews, specifically collecting qualitative data from interviews, but also just collecting qualitative data in general. What's the best way to ask a clear, meaningful question? How do we interact with our interview participants? In general, how do we produce really qualitative data? And then once we have that data, now we transition to where we are now. How do we begin to analyze it and make sense of it? So today we'll be going over one, how do you organize it? Whether or not you've collected your qualitative data from just a few questions in a survey or from several semi-structured interview, either way, you're going to have a lot of text data, information in general. So how do we organize that in a good way? And then how do we analyze it? Again, a huge amount of information, and it's not necessarily structured like a survey where you can neatly pick out a numerical understanding of it. So how do we analyze that? And we're going to focus mainly on a method simply referred to as coding. And I know that at this point you've heard of this term or this process multiple times. I think I've mentioned it at least once or twice, and I know Dr. James has mentioned it as well. Things like coding your data or having a code book, things like that. So today we'll just go into a little bit more depth on that topic, and then leading into interpretation. So once we've coded our data and we have it all labeled, how do we interpret it? How do we bring that all together in a way that makes sense for us, the researcher, and for our audience? And related to that, how do we go about writing our results, telling that story in a compelling and persuasive way that really makes sense? So first of all, your data. Again, you might just have qualitative data that was collected from a few open-ended survey or questions at the end of your survey. Or you might have done a fully qualitative based study, for example, interviews where you have a load of maybe it's audio data, or maybe you've taken really extensive notes during those interviews. Either way, you probably have some written memos, or also just your qualitative observations that you've taken while doing your field research. So there's lots of different types of qualitative data, and today we're going to kind of split it into two groups in a way. So we'll briefly touch on analyzing that qualitative data that comes from a survey. And then we'll transition to analyzing a whole qualitative study. And by that, I mean data that you get from those semi-structured interviews that you do. And while there is a lot of overlap between those two types of data, there are some slight differences in how we might go about organizing and understanding that information. But in general, in either case, when you organize your data, I mean, some of this stuff you guys already know, but just for the sake of making sure we're all on the same page, we want to keep it clean. So it's going to be a lot of data. It's going to be a lot of text data, and we want to make sure that we organize it in a way that is not only easy for us as the researcher to follow and to understand, but also that it's clean enough, simple enough to read that other researchers can easily make their way through it as well. Ideally, as we've talked about before, you'll want to be kind of sharing your results and ideas with other researchers, with other people in your field, to make sure everyone's on the same page and kind of seeing the same things in that qualitative research to decrease the influence of researcher bias and to increase a sense of reliability or rigor in your analysis. And then, of course, we've talked pretty extensively about those IRB standards, or the ethical standards that we want to reach with our social science research in general. And a big part of that, as we know, is the safety, the confidentiality of our participants, or maybe they're even anonymous participants. So when we collect data from them, we're taking their information, and we have to then ensure that we are handling it in an appropriate way. So that just needs to be secure. Maybe once you've collected it, it comes to you in an anonymous or confidential form, but perhaps not. And that's especially not typically the case with interview data, where we're interacting with the people we're interviewing. We usually know their name somehow. So some basic things: we want to keep our data, if it's on a computer, which it likely will be, we want to keep it in a password locked computer, maybe even a password locked folder, so no one else can get into it without appropriate permission. If it's possible, as soon as you can, you want to remove the names or identifying features from your interview data or from your data in general. And then this also applies to how you manage your data, how you organize it, even while you're doing your research in the field, especially if you're doing research, or especially if you're doing surveys or interviews. You're probably bouncing around different areas, maybe going out different days. You might have a backpack with you, maybe with a notebook in it. How can we ensure that there's not sensitive information written in our notes that could be stolen or fall out of our backpack and end up in the wrong hands, and either way breach or break the agreement that we have with our participant? So think about these things. Maybe you don't want to take down any names in the notes that you take, for example, or use code names. Just be careful about how we organize it in a confidential and secure way. And then finally here, this is, again, it's a no-brainer. We all know this, but it doesn't help to be continually reminded. I forget a lot to do this, unfortunately, but we want to back up our data. So we want to have it in more than one form, or saved in more than one place if it's on a computer, especially, as we all know, probably computers can crash. We can have technical difficulties, and it would be really terrible to lose all of your data at once like that. So really be sure that it's saved in multiple locations, secure locations. And typically we're going to organize our data on an Excel sheet, right? So you'll have your different columns that correspond to different questions. I'm sure I know James really, he talked about this, how we convert kind of our word-based responses, like slightly agree, strongly agree, convert those into numbers. All of that can be done in an Excel sheet. So for the most part, you're going to do some organizing of your data in an Excel sheet, or Google Sheets, which is just a free access, open access version of pretty much the exact same features. You might also have it in a Word document, but I'm guessing that this will be the most common. So we're going to jump right into analysis here, right into coding. And I know that you guys have been introduced to this term already, but to review, coding is just the process of labeling and organizing our data to identify different categories, themes, ideas, relationships among them in general. And when we do this, we label different portions, different amounts of text. It could be a word, it could be a phrase, it could be a whole paragraph or a section. In general, you're just breaking your data down and labeling it in different ways so that you can actually, as a human, begin to process it and make sense of it all. Have some way of organizing it. And so here you see the word code. You also see the word theme here. And so a code, just to kind of tease those apart a bit, a code is kind of a lower level idea, or it's a name that's being given to describe exactly what's kind of being said, whereas a theme is this larger idea. So you may have many different codes that fit into one theme. So let's say a theme could be project success, and you have something like your different codes. Your different codes are the smaller broken down parts that fit within that theme. Maybe that's like adequate funding would be a code, or strong personal relationships, different things like that. So just want to kind of tease that apart. And also to give you an idea of how to conceptualize this, maybe coding of interview text or of qualitative data in general was taking place long before we had the computer. The computers now really help us process this information. In fact, there are several software programs that are designed specifically to help us code, organize, and analyze qualitative data. But before that was an option, there was manual hand coding, and that happened in a few ways. So, and I think this is a helpful way to maybe visualize what's going on here. Before the computer, you might have printed, I mean, not before the computer in general, because you can still print, but before we had all this tech-savvy Excel or software to help us analyze the data, and it was more of a manual, human-based process. You often saw printed interviews, the text, the transcript text, and sometimes people would cut out pieces of that text that would be coded in a certain way, and they would actually pull out, let's say, a drawer of files, and they would file that piece of text into the code where it belongs. Or maybe they have their interview transcript, and instead of cutting it out, maybe they write down that section on a note and again stick it in the file that corresponds to that code. And maybe there's several code files within one file full of themes. So that's a helpful way to think about what coding is and why it's important. We're labeling the different parts of our data, different parts of information, so that we can open that drawer. And let's say we want to find instances of challenging relationships among landowners and government officials, and we can pull out that file and open it up, and inside are the texts, pieces of text that correlate to that code. And so that's kind of a helpful way to envision the process that we're doing. But also I'm going to show you some examples. I'm going to share some screen examples with you so we can actually go through that process together. I think it's more helpful to see it in action than to just have it described, and it's pretty simple to share. So when we go through this coding process, in general, we're looking for patterns. So things like frequencies, how often is something happening, or the magnitude, like how much, or to what level, or to what extent. We might be looking for different types of things. Let's say we're looking at relationships. What are the different types of relationships? There's acquaintances, there's work colleagues, there's family, there's friend, as examples. We might be looking for different processes. Is there an order among certain parts of a situation or an event? Do stages progress in a certain way? We might be looking for causes. That's easy. What causes this, or what's a common factor that leads to this other part of the event? And on the flip side, what are the consequences, or what are the effects that we're seeing? So those are some helpful things to look for as we're identifying patterns, which is the purpose of coding. But also, in general, you just want to be looking for different details of the story, and also kind of the big picture, what's going on here. And then again, these kind of general details like the who and the what and the when and the where. This will kind of make more sense as we go through it. But These are some key things to just have in your mind as initial things that we'll be looking for. And then I have this picture here of a very nice watercolor painting. A lot of researchers, a lot of people, I should say, would say that the process of coding, or maybe just qualitative analysis in general, is just as much of an art as it is a science. So one, there's not perfect steps to take that are going to guarantee your success. And also there's a bit of a flow to it, and you do kind of have to work your muscles and get used to what you're looking for and how you're going to look for it. So it's kind of just like learning how to paint. We can't tell you just exactly how to do it and send you off, and the first time you do it, it'll be perfect because you followed steps 1 through 10. It can be a bit of a fluid process that you need to just get used to working with, and you will get better with it over time, as you would if you learned how to paint and practice painting every week. So in general, there are kind of these 2 main types of coding. There's the deductive method, where we actually begin with a list of codes. These are things that we're looking for in our data, and we'll just check them off as we see them, assign that code. So this will depend, which type of method, which type of coding you choose will depend, again, on your research question and what your methods are, what the previous literature tells you might be best, and just your research design in general. So this, I would, let's say you have an open-ended question on a survey, and you're looking for very specific things in your responses and really not interested in aspects outside of that list, then you would use the deductive method. And ideally, those codes would be based on previous literature, based on a theory. You're not just coming up with them out of thin air, right? And they're related somehow to your hypothesis, and you're just checking them off as you see them. On the other hand, inductive coding, it's just really the opposite. So rather than arriving with a list of codes, you arrive with no codes, pretty empty-handed, and you create them as you go based on what you're seeing. And this is the type of exercise that I'm gonna run us through today. It could potentially be a bit more difficult, and maybe for that reason, it's helpful that we go through that inductive way of coding, and by understanding inductive coding, will also get you through the key parts of understanding how you would do deductive coding too. So some just general ideas to keep in mind when we talk about and when we do coding for our data. One, when we come up with the codes, we want to make them based around categories and themes, not individual words, if that makes sense. So for example, a category might be quality communication, whereas if we labeled based on the words, which would not be helpful, it would be way too much to handle. We might see things like honest communication, speaking frequently, keeping in touch. That would be way too many codes to keep up with, and all of those are really speaking to the same category, which is quality communication. Secondly, we want to really cover as much content as we possibly can, and as much content is relevant as well. So we don't want to be too vague. We don't want the code to be so broad that it covers too much of a variety of responses, if that makes sense. But we also don't want it to be too narrow, that it's too specific, that it's not even really useful, and it doesn't really help us break down the data into those different themes. So you're kind of looking for this sweet spot where they're not too vague, but not too specific. So kind of back to this communication example. let's say too specific might be something that's like communication that is honest and compassionate with coworkers. Way too specific, even though it's about communication. That might not apply to many responses, and we want to make grouping, so it needs to be somewhat more open than that. So again, we might just want to say quality communication, much more broad, but not too broad where it's just communication in general. Hopefully that one makes sense. Kind of on a similar note, we want to avoid too much overlap or too much similarity with our codes. So your codes, they should serve some different purposes here. So let's say, again, we have quality communication and defined leadership. Those are clearly very different areas. Where let's say we have defined leadership and visionary leaders. Is there enough overlap there where we could just combine them into one category? So some of this is kind of going to be up to you as you're presented with the data. Are those distinct categories, or are they overlapping to the point where it's really just one code? If there's just subtle differences, it's not a clear difference, you typically want to group it together. And we'll go over some examples of what this looks like in action. And then also consider both the positive and the negative aspects. So, I mean, this is kind of a given. If we're looking at the whole picture and all the details, of course, we're going to see the positive and negatives, but really we want to be active about this and looking for all the nuances of the data. And in general, it can really be helpful for us to find those points of contrast. It can help us analyze the entire spectrum of a situation. So look for things like success versus failure, or challenge versus opportunity, or just positive versus negative in general. And then again, after we've made sure that we have pretty exhaustive codes of all the data that we have, but that are not too vague and not too specific, and we're making sure that they're not overlapping too much with each other, we do want to reduce those codes in general. So you will encounter situations where you might have hundreds of codes, which sounds like a lot. It is. But there's a certain point where it's just too much to handle. But hopefully if you've reduced your overlap and made sure that your codes are not too specific and they're appropriately broad, then you're able to reduce it to the point where you can actually handle those and process them in a way that is manageable. And then in general, we want to maintain accuracy. So remember, as we reviewed last week with qualitative research, because we're handed over a large amount, especially with interviews, a large amount of unstructured, extensive data, and it's up to us to make sense of that, interpret it, and read through all of it. There is the potential, there's always the potential, but there's more potential for your researcher bias to influence your data. And that's why we went through our researcher identity, kind of trying to figure out where that could happen and how we might be aware of it and reduce it where possible. So some things to help maintain your accuracy of analysis and coding in general is to have some kind of guidelines that you follow throughout the process. So this, for example, your code book, where you start writing down as you come up with them your code, and then the description, a very clear description of what's being included in that code. What are the boundaries, or what are the parameters? And maybe you'd want to take some notes throughout your coding process, maybe the evolution of the coding, or just kind of like you took memos after your interviews. What's going on in your coding process? How are things that are evolving? Why did you choose to put this code there but not there? Why did you get rid of that category? Things like that. There's also a chance or a risk that as we're going through that coding process, which I should say can take weeks or months, and we'll see why. We have to continually kind of revisit that data and go over it again and again. So it can take a long time. And as you're going through the data, sometimes what can occur is called definitional drift. So you might have a definition in your head when you start coding your data. Let's say, again, back to quality communication. You might have a certain definition of what gets coded as quality communication. But as you go and time has passed and you're much deeper into your data and into your own understanding of it, you might have a different idea, a different definition of what fits as quality communication. But you might not actually realize that you've developed or drifted toward a different understanding of that. So by having these guidelines, it can help us kind of avoid that, having those clear definitions, and then in general, just reviewing the data. So this will be clear, you're not going to code it just once. You'll have to go through it again, revisit, reorganize as you go. And then thirdly here, to help us increase the accuracy of our just basic, even just labeling of the coding, we want to share our codes, at least a few coded sections or whole interviews or question responses with some colleagues that can kind of check us, make sure there's not a crazy amount of bias getting in there, kind of come together and say, yes, I agree, or I don't agree. Why did you do this way? Just a kind of a verification process. Okay, so I'm going to show you an example here of how we might go about coding responses to an open-ended question producing qualitative data on a survey. So I'm going to have to share my screen with you, and this was the question. It's pretty specific. Notice that it also kind of sets an expectation of the respondent of how much answer to give. In a couple of sentences, what were some of the key factors that led to the success of the project? So that's pretty straightforward. What factors led to success? On the flip side, and maybe a more open, maybe even more broad would be, describe your last conservation project. It would be much broader, but this is pretty to the point. So I'm going to share my screen with you. Oh, I guess I'm still sharing. Let's see. So I'm going to pull this up. Remember that most of our data is probably organized into an Excel sheet. So this is what our survey data might look like. You have our quantitative responses over here, and highlighted in blue, we've entered those qualitative responses. You can see a lot of text in there. What you want to do is take this section out and actually put it into a new page, because you're going to be doing a very different type of analysis on it, and it needs its own space completely. So I've copied and pasted those responses into a new sheet. You can see here's my question, the different respondents, and then their answers here. So you might have noticed the little running man on the last screen. So I would suggest at this point that you give your best first shot, or maybe it's not your first shot, but kind of work those muscles, your coding muscles here. So based on what we know so far, how do you think you might code this data? So what you can do is pause here and go through and start indicating what maybe in your head, ideally on paper, kind of what are the categories that you're finding here? What are you labeling? How are you labeling? What are your codes? Maybe you get to the point where you start seeing your big themes and the categories and the codes within them. So you can pause here. Hopefully you can see these answers. You can scroll down a bit. You can pause here and try this chunk. You can try this chunk as well if you want to pause here. So just give it a first crack, and then I'll continue on. So this is kind of step one, just organizing it in a way that makes sense. And hopefully you've had some time to kind of start identifying what you perceive as the key parts, key ideas, categories here, and coding them. I'm going to move us to step two. So this is just, in my opinion, what I kind of start seeing as my initial codes. So these are the response. It's essentially just breaking down the responses to this question. What are some of the key factors that led to success? So first one, super easy, trust and perseverance. Second one, we have communication, similar goals. So we're basically just making these pots, and we're going to throw different parts of answers into those pots, if that makes sense. So you can see highlighted in blue kind of what I've picked out as people's responses to this question. And already, just in the very beginning, you start to see some areas of overlap. We see partnership, partner positions, partners, things like that. So then what? And I should also say that you want to do, so I've just started reading. Typically, I wouldn't go through and highlight every word. That's just for illustrative purposes to give you an idea of what I'm seeing or what another researcher might be seeing in the data. But what you would want to do is, there's not many answers here, 100 and something. It wouldn't take that long, but either way, it's necessary to read through the questions first. Read through all the responses and get a really good idea of the whole spectrum, the extent of the responses here. Really get in deep with your data and start to know it. So take some time, read through every single answer, and even just through that process, coming out of it, you'll probably have a good idea just in your head, not in a formal way, but in your head, of what are the main points here? What are the key factors? What are my codes going to be? And that's going to save you time later. And I hope you'll see why. So we've done our read through. Now we're actually going to start assigning codes. So we go to step 3 here. So this is a method that I would recommend. Again, there's software to do this type of qualitative analysis, but we have Excel or we have Google Sheets. And this is pretty accessible. So this is kind of the purpose, one of the purposes of this course is to share social science methods in a way that is accessible for everyone. So we're going to stick with Excel for this one. And kind of the recommended method here is to put your codes in the top row. You can see I have trust, perseverance, those two are easy, communication. And as I go down through each answer, I'm going to throw a number 1 in each of these boxes where I see that code or that idea in the response. So you can see here, I'm going to mark for this one partnership, coming together. So coming together and compromise, I don't really know if I have a code for that yet. So you can do 2 things here. You can go ahead and create that code. You can put a new category here. Let's say coming together. And you can add it right off the bat in there, coming together. Or maybe you're not sure you want to make a whole code for that yet, and you just put it in other, which is helpful because at the end, when we get through our first round of many of coding, we'll have a whole bucket of other. And those are things that we haven't been able to assign to a specific code yet. We can revisit those and maybe start to reorganize them in other areas. So I might keep going through this. We have coming together again. So you're going to make your way all the way through, putting these ones where you see appropriate. Then we get to stage 4. So at this point, I've put all my ones in. I've basically coded all of the responses here. And you can see my codes have grown. And then what you can do is sum up the codes in, or sum up how many responses, how many codes you have in each category. So we see here a lot of respondents citing collective vision and partnership and local support as key factors in the success of their project. What we also want to notice here is those areas where there's maybe an underrepresented code. So remember, sorry, all the switching back and forth. We don't want to have too many codes, or else what's the point of breaking down the data into these digestible parts? So for example, defining roles only came up once. Maybe I decide that that can be combined, condensed into a different category. So what I'll do is go back and find that response. I think you can actually sort it here. So that pulls up my answer there. I can reread it, figure out, does it need to be its own category or does it fit into one of these others? And in general, because I don't want to have too many categories at all, if I have a lot of underpopulated categories, I will just create a whole new category that says other and put them in there because they're not really that well represented. We still want to note them, but they might not need their whole own category. So this is kind of the second phase. You want to go through your data again and kind of check, revisit what you've done. Again, we don't want to have that definitional drift. So you've gone through over 100 responses. Some time has passed. You did your initial assigning. Now you want to go back and revisit those, make sure everything is coherent and it makes sense throughout, that you've made the correct assignments throughout, and see if you need, or see how you need to reorganize, because you definitely will need to reorganize. So here I've kind of, I've reorganized my codes. You can see I did create that other category. I took out defining roles, kind of just made it a clearer, more concise picture of what's going on here. I still have some categories that are maybe underrepresented, but that's because I decided that no, they couldn't be condensed into other categories, and they do still stand out in their own way, and they are still important to the story. So notice that I said, I decided that. So again, there's that place for subjectivity in this process. I'm just reading other people's words and making my own assumptions about what they're saying, what's important and what's not. Of course, I've read a bunch of theory and literature about what's going on here, and I'm following my own guidelines and making some informed decisions about how I'm assigning codes, but in general, a lot of that's coming on my own interpretation of the data. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. This is an easy way to organize here. I'm going to take us back to the PowerPoint presentation. Hopefully. Okay. So moving on from that. Hopefully you keyed into the fact that that is a very ongoing, lengthy process. So you don't just go through the coding process once. It's what we call an iterative process, which is a systematic and repetitive process. So it goes really in cycles. So I'm going to read through first my responses, and then I'm going to assign the codes. And then I'm going to go back and revisit what I've just done. Maybe spend a few days just leaving it, come back, revisit, reorganize. I might create new codes. I might take some out. I'm going to adjust how I've placed them. It's going in these cycles. At some point, we're going to want to share our results or what we've done. And this is to ensure what we call intercoder reliability. And I think you might have heard this term already. But again, to review, this is just when two or more people independently on their own, so without discussing or coming together first, they independently review the codes and the assignment, and later on down the road, just the analysis and interpretation in general. This again is to reduce the bias that comes from that one primary researcher and to improve the reliability and the rigor of your study. So after, let's say, back to that Excel sheet that we just went over on that step 5, at that point when I'm kind of secure with what I've done and feeling confident about it, I would create a new copy somehow that doesn't have any of those codes, doesn't have any of the numbers, and send it to somebody else and ask them to code that as well. So there's some challenges here. One, that's very possible that's possible if you have a team. This isn't quite a challenge. That's possible to do if you have a team of researchers and they're all purposefully dedicated to that project and they have the time to do their own coding process. That would be great. However, that's not always the case. So what you might do, instead of sharing a whole blank sample of codes and asking them to do that whole kind of exhausting process that you just did, there's a couple ways that you can still get at that intercoder reliability. One, you could share just a sample of that data. So maybe you pick, I think there were, let's say, 150 answers there. You could pick a section of maybe 50 of them and just send them a section of 50 and ask them, what are the codes or categories you're seeing here? Write them down. A second way that you could do it is, I was going to say maybe not as great, but it's still definitely something. Once I've gotten to that step 5 where I have all my codes assigned, I could send that Excel sheet to another researcher for them to review. They'll be looking at my codes, but I can really ask them, look at the data, please recode where you see appropriate. I've done that for somebody. What I do in Excel is kind of mark with, I highlight the cells where I've made a change. So if I take out a code, I put a red cell. If I insert a code somewhere else, I put a green cell. When I say insert, I mean if I'm putting a 1 somewhere. And then maybe a little short summary at the end. I've condensed this category into this category because blah, 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 or I'm not really sure that this code makes sense. I don't know what you mean by this title. So the downside there is that that other researcher receiving the codes already has your codes in there. So by nature, they're going to be a bit influenced by what is already there. But hopefully that they are a trained researcher as well, and they do have the ability to kind of put that aside and take their own interpretation process of the coding. Either way, the point is that you have someone else check in on your work and make sure everything's going logically. Okay, so then how do we represent those results? That's a lot of information. And how do we condense it and make it digestible for other people so they don't have to do all that work? Pretty common for this type of coding, and by this type I mean where it's just like one question, maybe a few questions that are very specific on the end of a survey. It's pretty easy to represent them with graphs where we just say, break down the number of respondents who mentioned certain factors in their response. So here's the graph of what came out of that coding example that I just showed you. Also notice here in the figure description that it says, so this is kind of showing where areas were condensed. And I think the reason this is explained here rather than just condensing it without explaining what has been condensed is because maybe these nuances are important to mention, but not to have their own code. So we say, note that quality communication includes frequent interactions and exchanges. So that was previously its own code, but it got condensed. But we still want to just clarify. Same goes for having a strategy plan. You can read includes clear and defined roles and objectives, which were previously two different codes that were underrepresented, so they got combined. Makes it a little bit more digestible for your audience. Okay, so, and I say graphs for this type of qualitative research. This is kind of more of a flat, what we call a flat analysis, where we had a very specific question, if you remember. What are the key factors leading to success in your last project? There's not too much room for the answers to go all over the place, if that makes sense, in this response. Whereas if we had said, describe your last project, that is so broad. That's fine to ask, but it's so broad that it could really, we could have people describing challenging projects. We could have people describing successful projects. So there's more nuance to deal with there. Whereas this is a more of a flat analysis, and it's more appropriate to just represent it in a graph, just showing this is exactly what people said. Also, we typically want to show some representative quotes, and I'll kind of show you what that means. So again, for the same example that I just showed you, these quotes are too long. This you wouldn't want to, this, well, it depends. So this is not, these are not quotes for a journal article. This is for like a practitioner audience. So this is a very long report. Typically you would condense this, but the point is here you see all of our categories, and then we have a quote in each of these boxes that kind of shows what we mean, essentially, with that title. So it's showing your audience what counts as data. So rather than just saying flexibility, kind of give them an example of, this is what we were coding as flexibility. When we say flexibility, this is an example of what we mean. So remember that if you have your code book that has a description of what qualifies in each code, this is where you're showing your audience what qualifies. It's a little easier for them to see and understand if they can actually read it. And this one increases the depth of the information that you provide when you have a quote to help you tell that story. But then also it increases your transparency of your process as a researcher. So you don't just, you're showing people, look, this is why I assigned this code. You can kind of trust that these labels make sense. Okay, back to the PowerPoint. And then finally, we typically want to give some sort of a narrative description of the results that we found. So the graph is helpful, the representative quotes are helpful. And then essentially we're collecting stories and breaking them down and retelling them in a condensed, more digestible form for our audience. So we do also want to give kind of that narrative description, which might be something like the two most prominent factors in recent project success include funding and partnership, and kind of throw some different bits of quotes in there to help you tell that story. You might want to hit on some of these different categories, make it a kind of a holistic understanding of, this is what we saw here. Not a whole book, but a few paragraphs explaining what's going on, how these pieces maybe even fit together. Okay, so as I just mentioned, that was kind of like a flat coding. It was just how many people are saying these different things. Whereas on the other hand, we have hierarchy coding. So remember, if I had said, describe your last restoration project, it might have broken down into more levels. So not just factors to success, but levels of just different ideas. So this is a very simple way. Let's say some people are talking about opportunities and some people are talking about challenges. And within those, we have more codes that are breaking that down into even smaller parts. It's much more complex because we can break down multiple areas of one theme. And kind of which approach you take is going to depend yes on your research question, what question you're asking specifically in that moment, how you want to approach it as a researcher. Perhaps you do have a predefined a list of codes and you're just going to do flat coding, or maybe you have a predefined list of hierarchical codes and you want to go through it that way. So it depends on what you're asking and what type of information you're wanting to get. And typically this kind of hierarchical coding is more common, especially when you're doing semi-structured interview data and you just have a wealth of all this unstructured information, and you're going to see it broken down into more complex ways. So we will go ahead and transition to that. Again, what we just did was more so for those open-ended questions on a survey, where it's pretty pointed, pretty specific, and you're likely to get much shorter answers than, of course, if you're doing an hour-long interview and you have paragraphs and paragraphs and pages of text to analyze. So this is going to look a little bit different. Just as a reminder, you will, well, if possible, if at all possible, ideally, you would want to transcribe your interview audio into text. Yes, it's a lengthy process. On average, for every 1 hour of interview, it takes about 4 hours to transcribe it into text. So it can be a lengthy process. You'll probably have a load of data to go through, but it is also really useful for a couple of reasons. One, of course, it's useful to have your data in that text form because that just makes analysis so much easier when you can actually go through and see exactly what was said and bounce around and just have it there right there in front of you, kind of a hard format, not just bits and pieces in notes, or you don't have to go back and listen to certain parts of the audio file. So the investment is worth it. Secondly, one way to have a really successful qualitative analysis is to really know your data, be familiar with it, all parts of it. And when you go through, you actually take the time to transcribe your interviews, you get to know your data really well. You're probably listening to it at a little bit slower than normal pace, if that's possible on your software. Slow it down so you can keep up. And just the process of actually following along and writing it is a great way to take your first pass, in a way, your first pass through that data. And that is going to be beneficial. And it's actually going to serve you in the future and improve your upcoming analysis by getting to know it in that way. So some downsides, some upsides, but definitely useful. Would definitely recommend that you do it if you can. If you have the budget to, some research, people pay other companies or individuals to transcribe their interviews. But if not, I would recommend taking the time to do it yourself. Quick note here, a lot of people say, we have these filler words when we speak. Things like, I don't know about where you are, but in the US, a lot of people say "you know" a lot, and these phrases that don't have any meaning at all, and 9 times out of 10 don't actually contribute to or change the meaning of what's being said. So, quick hot tip: when you're transcribing, most researchers would say that it's okay to not type those words, and it'll actually save you quite a bit of time. Okay, so now moving on to coding the interview data. Again, all of the concepts that we discussed earlier about exhaustive codes, about minimizing overlap, not being too vague but not being too specific, coding categories and themes, not by words, all those things still apply here. We're just going to expand on that a little bit. So hopefully remember that after each interview that you've done, maybe before, but hopefully after each one, you've taken a memo. And these are just notes to yourself about things that you learned, things that were interesting for that interview, or as you go through your entire data collection process, your memos hopefully will have started taking note of emerging themes or concepts, ideas, things that are interesting notes to your future self about what aspects you might want to analyze, or what relationships you're already seeing before you even get to the coding process. The memos have helped you start analyzing. But by the time you get to your actual coding process, some of those interviews are weeks or even months in the past. So start by reviewing your memos and kind of jog your memory. This is what I'm working with here. That was already kind of the first stage of your analysis. So just revisit it. And then after that, hopefully you'll have written your transcripts. If not, that's okay. Let's say maybe instead you have really good extensive notes. Either way, then you want to review those. So you might not have time to read through every single one, but take a little subset and read through them thoroughly. And again, kind of start mulling over that data. What are some things that you're seeing? What are some potential codes that you are going to create? This is going to minimize, it feels like a lot of upfront time, and it is, but it'll minimize the time that you spend on this project overall. Because that way you're not just arriving to your data and starting to throw codes wherever you see them arise. You have some sort of idea of what are going to be meaningful codes, and what are going to be single occurrences or too specific. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, so I threw 2 points at you there. We're going to start coding. So now you've done all this initial review process. You're very familiar with your data. Now you can start coding. The reason that we spend more time with our interview data rather than in contrast to how little time we spent comparatively going over the single open-ended questions is just because there's so much of it. It's so complex and there's so much to structure or so much to process. So you want to be way more familiar with it. And it takes more time and more work to do that. So finally we get to the part where we can start coding. It's again the same kind of process where as you go through, you start coming up with codes and assigning the parts of your data to your code. And there's a couple ways to do this, at least. You can do it on a per question basis, where you come up with a set of codes for each question. It's exactly what it sounds like. Just like we did in that example. Go to question 2, and we have a new set of codes. When you do that, likely because your interview is focused in some way, you are going to have the same topics coming up, so there's going to be some overlap, but it's perhaps more manageable to do it on a per question basis versus the whole interview, which is useful for other reasons. So I might have a list of 120 codes that I can apply or assign wherever I want throughout the interview. It's not just sectioned off into one question. And again, this is helpful because a lot of times we're kind of talking about one or a few major topics or situations or events or themes coming at it from different angles. So it would make sense that something mentioned, let's say in question 1, comes up again in question 10, and we want to assign it the same code. The challenge here is that, in my opinion at least, that because we are working with kind of these more accessible, cost-friendly analysis methods, that it will be difficult to use that whole interview approach for your codes. Remember, you'll have pages and pages, hundreds of pages of text. So it's not quite as easy to just put that all into an Excel sheet. Whereas if you did it on a per question basis, you could copy the responses to each question and very simply, very easily put it into an Excel sheet and do your coding for that question. So rather than spend too much time on coming up with you some ways to do that whole interview coding process. I'm going to leave that up to you guys for now. There's definitely ways to do it. I mean, you can still copy and paste bits and pieces of interviews into your Excel sheet. That's up to you of how you want to play with that and make sense of it. For the purpose of this course, because it's more of a beginner course, I'm not going to really go too much to depth on how we can do a whole interview coding. It's definitely possible though, and you guys are all super intelligent, so you could come up with your own method essentially of how to organize that, how to break down the data. Okay, so the code, when you're doing your interview coding, because it's much more broad and kind of all over the place, and remember, you might get some weird answers that had nothing to do with the question that was asked. There's just going to be so much information around you. Make sure that your codes are reflecting your research question, or as I put here, your RQ, and the actual purpose of your study. So yes, while it's important to code things as you see them and to like assign whenever possible an idea or a concept, yes, important to do that, but also be able to recognize where something is just completely irrelevant and you don't need to waste your time or space or energy assigning a code to it. There's a danger there because you might at some point through your analysis find out that that was relevant, but that'll make itself apparent in the review, revisit, reorganize, review process. But always have, again, I mean, we say this all the time, always have your research question in mind and your purpose. It all comes back to that every stage of the research process. And then again, same one here. We always want to refer to literature and theory. Hopefully at this point you've spent, at this point in the research process, you've spent a considerable amount of time going over that literature and other theories. You have it in your head, in your back pocket, so that you can look through those lenses as you interpret, as you analyze your own data, and you're not coming up with your own theories, which is definitely possible too. I should say that you can come up with your own theories as you go, but they should be informed by some previous knowledge. And this will kind of help you narrow in on some certain ideas and directions of understanding as well. And then again, this whole thing, just as we did with the qualitative open-ended questions in the survey, we want to do that with the interview data too. So review, reorganize, keep revisiting your codes and making sure everything is in the right place. Maybe the third time you pass through it, you realize I've been completely missing this the whole time, or I've put it in the wrong category, I had too many, who knows? You're always going to be learning more about your data the deeper that you get into it, and the greater that your understanding becomes. And then again, we want to share our data with another researcher, another colleague, to have them go over the coding process, ideally with at least 2 interviews. You can give them, in this case, you could give them the interview transcripts and ask them to do just a phase 1 of coding. So ask them to read through and essentially just do initial coding. They don't necessarily have to go through the review, reorganize process. But once they have their initial set of codes, then you guys, for a couple interviews, you guys can, or you gals, can meet up again and go over there, find discrepancies, check your bias, things like that. So in general, the process of moving from codes to these larger categories to the overarching themes looks kind of like this. So you start at that smaller level, you make your groupings of codes and the categories as you move from the smaller parts to the on-the-ground kind of specific descriptions of exactly what's happening, or not exactly, but descriptions of what's happening, to these larger, more general ideas, theories, explanations about what is going on, and probably some ideas about why it's happening. But it's not going to look that clean. So especially with these huge amounts of interview data, there's just going to be so much information. You'll have codes over here and codes over there, and themes and relationships among them. You'll have different ideas of causes and effects, and when these conditions are present, then this typically results, or in this case, we see blah, blah, blah. But typically, I mean, you're going to have all these different ways of looking at your data and how these ideas and themes relate to each other and maybe influence or overlap with each other. So it can be hard to even make sense of this as you begin to interpret your results. Overall, you've just collected, let's say, 50 people's stories, and you're trying to make sense of all of that and digest it into another story. So in all of that, the short way to explain is you want to find the story. And again, you might start off kind of looking like this big mess, and it might not be that clean, it might not be that straightforward, but there is something in there. So just be confident, spend your time with it, kind of picking it apart. And we'll go into some maybe tips and tricks of what's the best way to start breaking down all this information further. So you're probably at this point just full of ideas of what is going on here. If we've gone through all the steps, I mean, you had first, even just to begin with, you had these really in-depth interviews where you were really intensively and actively listening to what people are explaining to you. And then you have the memos, the written memos that you've taken along the way. And then let's say you transcribed your own audio files. So you've listened again to every interview and you've written it down. And then you have your coding process where you've again read through all those transcripts again. You've coded them. You've gone back and coded them again. So there's so many layers that you've gone through to have this really deep understanding. You have so much knowledge, and it's just about making sense of it all. Not to mention, you've read several other articles or books or journals, talked to other people in the field about relevant information as well. So you have a wealth of understanding. It's just kind of time to make sense of them. So kind of three key parts here. When you start to make sense of them and create that story and tell it, of course, what you say and what you interpret needs to be actually contextually grounded in your data. It needs to be based in your data soundly. This makes sense, right? You can't just make stuff up, and you don't want to be kind of throwing claims around it. It needs to come back to the data and be grounded in that some way. And then again, especially with our qualitative research, we want it to be grounded in some sort of theory, previous knowledge to help situate our own study and what else we know about these processes or about the phenomenon that we're studying. And then thirdly, the third important part here is that you want your findings to kind of be relevant, and hopefully you've gone through all the parts of the research design process that ensure a relevant study to begin with. But when you're picking apart the important aspects of the story, make sure that they're actually contributing to the purpose or to the understanding that you seek, whether that's to solve a particular problem or produce certain knowledge for a conservation organization to enact some sort of a policy or a program. When you tell your story, make sure you're finding parts that are actually relevant and of interest to the community that you're addressing or to the audience that you're sharing with. Okay, so really quickly, we went over the examples of those single questions. I don't have text examples to show you of full interviews at the moment, but what I can do is kind of show you what these code books look like. So I'm going to pull up just a few examples. This is really to illustrate what happens when with interviews we just have so many codes. How do we begin to organize them? It can be overwhelming at points. So let's see here. I'm going to show you a couple examples. This first one. Uh-oh, 1 second here. I don't know if you can see my screen. Okay, here we are. Sorry about that. So I'm going to pull up this. This is kind of, I want you to look over here at the, I don't know if my screen's flipped, over here, left or right side, over here on probably the left side, hopefully the left side. Question number 1. This was a question that was asked of participants. How do you feel about wildlife living nearby? Below here was the researchers' kind of first take at assigning of codes. So you can see there were kind of, this goes on, there's 41 codes for that one question. So what's happening here is they're basically going through and they're kind of labeling everything that they see, which is good, right? We want to be exhaustive. We want to cover all of the data that we're presented with, all the relevant data. That's a lot of codes though. And this interview had at least 10 questions, so 40 codes per question. Here's question 2, question 3. These are coded on a per question basis. That really adds up. Even if it didn't, in general, this is too many codes because you'll see that there are areas of overlap. So you see where let me zoom in so hopefully you can see here. These are kind of different things that they're seeing. These are their codes. I see some, hopefully you see them too, some areas of overlap. So we have unsafe animals, animals bring disease, scared of animals. Those are really similar. So to reduce our number of codes and areas of overlap, we would want to combine those. Hopefully you guys can see that. Here's another one, the blue. Children's school trips, children can see them. Both of those are too specific. So that was okay for first run around at coding because they're just getting to know their data. But on that second pass through, we want to reduce this. And then I'm going to point out a few other things here. So see these ones in italics here. These are kind of too vague. What are these saying? So how do you feel about wildlife living nearby? Education doesn't really tell us anything. Tourists, what does that mean? We can make guesses, but we want to make sure that our code categories are clear. Now it's possible that maybe somewhere there's a description for this code that goes into more detail about what that means, but just as an example to show you that we want to be specific, not too vague, not too specific, reduce overlap, or else we're just going to have thousands of codes to deal with that will be hard for us to process and really difficult for the audience to understand as well. Okay, so this was kind of the initial take at the code book. Then we went through and reorganized. So this is kind of what it looks like now. Question 1, how do you feel about wildlife living nearby? We broke that flat coding down into more of a hierarchical system so that we could see the complexity of what's happening there. So you see here, we have positive feelings. These are people who describe in some way feeling good about wildlife living nearby. Within that category, you'll see people who talk about economic benefits. Within that larger category, we have smaller codes here. So it provides jobs. It encourages tourism. It provides other resources. These are all housed within economic benefits. Move down to social benefits. It provides entertainment. Within that, there's these different ways that it provides entertainment. So all of those codes have been condensed into one because there was too much overlap among them, and also they were too specific. So the intention of this is just to kind of show you how this process evolves, and in a way, how difficult it can be to interact with our interview data. It takes a lot to break it down in a way that you can actually understand and make sense of. Okay, so where we had our positive, now we have our negative, and some categories in there for why those people perceived it as negative. And then lastly, just another example of just how to kind of format your code book or what it can look like. This is just another example. So you see have our, let's call this a theme. I should say also that this code book, these codes were created on an interview basis, not on a question basis. So I could have asked them question 1 and they discussed their project successes there. I could have asked them question 7 and they described their project successes there. Either way, it's getting tagged as a project success and it's going to end up somehow in this section. So here's our theme, project successes. There's different categories within it. We have community-related project successes, success related to the development of the organization, kind of these categories. It gets broken down. And again, within those, it gets broken down further. So education of the community or education of visitors or tourists to the project. And this goes on. This kind of theme is relationships. There's challenging relationships and smaller categories of what creates challenging relationships within that. And this really goes on. Then you can see in this middle category, it's not filled in at the moment, but if you're doing a really good code book, this should have a description of a guideline. What's included in this code? What do we mean by this title? That again just ensures validity and reliability of your process. And then you can see on the far hand over here, on the far side, we actually have numbers of occurrences within each area. So we have sources, the number of interviews that are cited, and then references, the number of sections or phrases. So I have 13 interviewees that discussed challenging relationships, and there's 19 different sections that touch on that. So what I'm also going to do is give you a quick scroll through to show you kind of the size of this code book. And this is why I mentioned that coding on an interview level can be really difficult. There's a lot going on. There's a lot to process, and that's why for now we are sticking with the per question analysis. Okay, back to this. Alrighty, on to writing. So I'm just going to quickly mention this again, that there's a potential for your bias to influence your analysis and interpretation of the results in general, and in that, how you write and share your results. So again, we want to dissect our researcher bias, find out how it might influence how we share our results. Also, a reminder that the data that we're dealing with is super complex and it's totally unstructured. It's just in an interview, at least, where there's so much and it's just kind of been thrown out there. So it can be really hard then to write about that, to break it all down in a way that you can actually tell that story and write it in a understandable format for other people in a way that's persuasive, or convincing or that actually make sense to any audience who's dealing with your results. The other difficult part about writing qualitative results is that there are going to be inconsistencies, and in that there is going to be some incompleteness of the data. This is inherent, or it just is something that comes with the nature of qualitative data. This is because, remember, these are semi-structured interviews. So a couple of things there. One, not every single interviewee is going to always be asked the question in the same way. Each interviewee might not be asked all of the questions. Maybe you ran out of time. Maybe some interviewees have been probed in different ways that the others have not. Or maybe they do all get the same question, but they interpret it and respond to it in slightly different ways and give you totally different types of information. So it's again kind of unstructured, and in that the type of information that you get is going to be a little bit inconsistent from case to case. Whereas with a survey, you have your question, you have your 5 answer responses, options, and there's only a certain amount of answers you can get. So this makes it hard to write about because there's always maybe something that we don't know, or this information came in a different way. That's okay. That's totally okay, but it's just something to be aware of. And I mention these things because I'm going to talk briefly about writing qualitative results using numbers. And the question here is kind of to use numbers or not to add, or not to use numbers. So this whole time we've been talking about qualitative and quantitative. Qualitative is words, narrative, description, and quantitative is numbers to tell that story. Almost as if it's a hard line, and it's not necessarily. There's some kind of overlap. We can use numbers to help us tell a qualitative research story. But there are some things to be aware of, some challenges to consider when we start involving numbers, and kind of think about how we do that so that it's not detractive from the way that we write our results. So in a big way, there's often, it's lessening now, but there's often this kind of pressure on qualitative research from other scientists or practitioners, professionals in general, to pressure them to include numbers in their qualitative writing, in their reports. And this is kind of, I think, coming from a place of understanding traditional science as a process that includes quantitative numerical values. You know, we want to see the numbers. This is what shows us results. And maybe an avoidance of, or not wanting to, maybe there's also a tendency, I think, for people who are uninformed of the rigor and the process of qualitative research as a scientific method, for those people to view it as presentation of anecdotal evidence. But if we do it appropriately, it's far more than anecdotes. It is science, and it's done in a scientific method. But those views can kind of pressure us to use numbers to show our data when it's not always appropriate. So there's a lot of controversy there, and I'm going to condense a bit and go into the benefits and the challenges of using numbers. So for one, yes, if you're using, you can use numbers where appropriate to show frequency and to kind of emphasize your points. You saw just a minute ago the numbers of the codes on the side of the document, how many occurrences there were of each idea or category. That's totally fine. But remember, because of this idea of inconsistency, well, let me focus on the positives before we go into the challenges. So yes, that's totally fine to use numbers to help tell your story. To say, for example, 90% of respondents mentioned that quality communication was an important part of their success at their conservation organization. And by doing this, you contribute to not the generalizability beyond your research project, but the generalizability within your project. So it helps verify that within your research, you're correctly identifying or characterizing the whole range or diversity of actions or perceptions in the group that you're studying, when you're able to kind of break it down into the numbers like that. And also by using numbers, it's a really easy way to help us identify where those patterns are. Sometimes this is not just so simply apparent if we don't use the numbers. And I should clarify quickly that, so a lot of times when we see qualitative writing, instead of using numbers to say, for example, 95% of people agreed that blank, it will be written more likely as a majority of people, most of people, kind of a more general term. And that ranges from most people, some people, a good portion, very few people, some outliers, participants mostly agreed, or almost collectively agreed, kind of these more general descriptors. And I'm going to use that then to transition into why it can be actually threatening to our writing of results to use numbers. So back to this idea of inconsistency. Remember that not everyone maybe got the same question in the same way, or they didn't respond to it in the same way. So it can be misleading to say 70% of respondents disagreed that blank, when not all of your respondents were presented with that question in the first place. Or maybe they were, but let's say 70% of respondents mentioned that their family was an important decision or important factor for them deciding to go to school. I mean, there's some wiggle room in there, right? Where, well, maybe, yes, they said that, but there's still this whole realm of what wasn't said or what wasn't construed or what wasn't asked. And so it can just be maybe an over-amplification of the generalizability of your results, even among that population. And then also remember that qualitative research is supposed to be this kind of rich, complex, nuanced understanding, telling of a story, if you will. It's supposed to be qualitative in nature. And sometimes if we inappropriately assign numbers when we're writing our results, we can actually flatten out those nuances or the complexity. And we run the risk of leading the researcher or the audience back to this kind of variable way of thinking, or thinking like based in like a variance theory, where it's very linear. Variable A influences variable B, 90% here, 6 out of 10 over there. That kind of undermines exactly what are the strengths of qualitative research. Kind of the whole idea is that quality in your evidence, not necessarily the amount of evidence as the indicator of its value, if that makes sense. So these are some things to think about. Yes, numbers can be helpful to show your patterns and to show kind of how things are generalized across your study population, to emphasize areas that are particularly prominent or maybe not prominent at all. But at the same time, there are some major concerns there in how that influences actually the quality of the results that we're showing. So just some things to be aware of. Where you use your numbers, if you use them at all, is going to depend on the information that you're dealing with. and kind of honestly, really a personal preference of whether that's an appropriate way to use it or is it misleading. Does it actually misconstrue the qualitative results that you're trying to share? For the most part, just me personally, I don't typically use numbers. I do the general descriptions, unless they're kind of really, in a couple cases, you can identify area. If you want to use numbers, at least identify the limitations that are involved in your using of those numbers. So I might have done a study on 25 local conservation organizations, and in my qualitative results, I write that 17 out of 25 of these indicated that they struggled financially. So that kind of indicates a huge portion of that. But remember, this is a very small sample. What if there were actually 35 local conservation organizations and I only spoke to 25? Just some things to be aware of. But if I say somewhere in my writing that there are other factors to consider here that influence your interpretation of this frequency, then that's okay. Also, maybe you have some questions in your interview, which hopefully are a few, but where it's kind of a yes or no thing. It's this or that. There's not a lot of room for inconsistency. There's not a lot of room for people to be outside of those parameters with their responses. In those cases, it's also more appropriate to use numbers. So I'm going to stop here. The point is, it's a kind of a nuanced area. There's different opinions about the best way to do things and where it's appropriate to integrate numbers or not. The point is that sometimes it is. So, interesting. Quickly, I'm going to show you just a few things. I picked some little bits and pieces from a qualitative research article sharing their results, just like really quick tips, things to consider when you're writing your own results, really reflecting what we've just discussed. So what I like about this is the first sentence in their results. This really touches on the nature of qualitative research in general. It says, across the interviews, trust or lack thereof emerged as one of the most important factors related to restoration success. This finding is particularly interesting because interviewees were not explicitly asked about trust. So this is the whole thing about qualitative research, right? You're going to get so much information. You ask these open-ended questions, and the interviewees take you where the story leads. So you might find stuff that you didn't even go out expecting to find. And this is really interesting to me. And interestingly enough, this question sounds the same as the example that we were going over earlier in the Excel sheet, but it's a totally different study. Don't want you to be confused. So some other things to note here. As they go through their results, again, you don't have those numbers to just say 70% here and 40% there, and statistically there's this trend here and there's this variance here. Okay, you don't have all those numbers. So what we typically do is then take all that information that we've just processed and tell a story. And we can do this in different ways. For sure, we want to break it down into these different parts. And you can do this depending on your research question and the results you get in different ways. You may break it down by time scales, different parts of a process, or different times, different beginning, middle, end, or 10 years ago, today, 10 years in the future. It could be by scale. Maybe it's local, state, national, international. It could be by different variables. It could be by different cases or by theme in general. So you see here, trust. They've organized their results by trust, talking about they're going to pull out some of the major themes that they found, and they did 43 interviews and break it down and start to talk about each of those themes there. Also, when you're analyzing, interpreting, and definitely writing your results, Yes, one, of course, you're looking for the major trends, but it's also really important, as we know in general, but really here too, to look for those outliers or the negative cases. And we kind of mentioned this earlier, is that when we find those negative cases or points of contrast, it really helps us expand our understanding, expand our ability to theorize about what's going on. We can't just say, oh, well, 90% of people said this, so that's just one kind of outlier out there, and we're not going to include that in our story. But that outlier is actually where something new exists. There's something different going on there, and so it's important for us to consider that and tell that in our story as well. Another just kind of general suggestion when you're writing qualitative research is first to take your first crack at writing your initial summary of results without using quotes. When we just go straight into using the quotes, we're liable to rely too heavily on them, and there is a chance that we get into sort of that anecdotal way of interpreting or sharing our results. So yeah, I would just recommend that first you do it without quotes, and that really helps you develop this rich, more holistic, well thought out explanation, and then you can go back and fill in the quotes where appropriate. And then, of course, at this stage also you want to be sharing your interpretation in this kind of written form, not only with the colleagues, as you've been doing throughout this process, but also with your participants. This is part of that verification that we mentioned in last session too. You've just taken all of their stories and interpretations and ideas from them, and it's now all on your shoulders, maybe shared with some other people, to interpret it and make sense of that. As we talked about, even in that interview, kind of coming back to them and saying, when you say this, do you mean this? And verifying that you've interpreted them correctly. You can do that at this stage too when you've written your results. You don't necessarily have to share it with every participant at this point, because it's going to go further to a final report, but you can choose a few maybe who have been very well engaged, or a few who represent some of the different perspectives that you're telling in your story, and ask them to review and say, did I get this correctly? Am I telling your story correctly? For the most part, if you've gone through the appropriate steps for a rigorous study, you will have done so. So it's not like they're going to, don't expect that they'll say absolutely not. But it's good practice to go through that process of sharing and asking for feedback. So I've circled some things here. Trust on the text. Trust, just to show how they're organizing their results, talking about themes. And then also you'll see that in this example, as is typically common, they're not relying heavily on numbers to tell their story. They're using words more so descriptive generally. So like you say, see, most participants is one example. They say widely believed, or how, yeah, so those are the only examples. Most and widely believed kind of just describe the portion of respondents who expressed that overall. Also circle around however. So this is just an example of how they've gone out of their way to point out that outlier. That's really important as we tell kind of the whole story. And it might not just be, sometimes an outlier is maybe just one case, or maybe it's just a few. You're gonna have to make some decisions there. What's a relevant outlier? And is it an outlier in a way that's relevant to your data, or is it an outlier in a way that maybe they have, it's an outlier for circumstances that aren't related to the purpose of your research, if that makes sense. But they should all receive some sort of due process of analyzing why they're outlying. And then also kind of circled here at the end, they have as a result. So we discussed in the beginning kind of looking for those patterns in our coding process, and one of them was consequences or effects of different parts of a process. And you also see there's different types of participants or interviewees that they had. So they had NGO representatives, they had landowner participants. That's kind of the who aspect. So different demographic, different types of entities might have different conditions, or they might fit into different themes or categories differently. So I think this is a really good example of a really quick to read, interesting example of writing qualitative research. If you do want to check it out, I put a reference here at the bottom. It's called The Role of Trust in Restoration Success: Public Engagement and Temporal and Spatial Scale in a Complex Social Ecological System, just for reference. Okay. Okay, moving on, we are nearing the end here. Kind of just rolling off of this section on writing, how do we discuss and actually share our results with our audience? In general, we discussed this last time, we want to be really clear about our methods, what actually counts as data. Some of this you can do when you show your representative quotes, but you want to show that there was some sort of systematic way of analyzing your data. And we always include information about our process of coding, related to best practices, things like that. Secondly, we want to talk about what have we learned throughout this process. So there's kind of one suggestion, one way to think about doing this is describing, comparing, and then relating. So describing is kind of just where you start. It's kind of an outline for the rest of the context of your study, where you're going to provide details about the sources of your data. Remember, when you first start that interview, you might ask that person some questions about themselves. Who are you? How did you end up here? What are you like? Get an idea of what your participants are like. The demographic features of your sample. This is kind of a backdrop for the rest of your analysis. And then you can move on to describing, your first major category or theme when you're writing. And you kind of want to describe or record the characteristics of that theme, kind of the spectrum, what's going on here. And maybe you have an outlier in there too. How was it discussed among participants? What aspects were important, or what was not included? What were some potential trends that we saw in this theme? And then move on to your next theme and describe that theme. And as you go through those, you'll make your way to the end. We can move on to the compare section. So we're going to look for some meaningful associations within one theme. I think my computer might die. I'm worried I'm gonna re-plug it in. I think it came out. Okay, sorry about that. We are keeping it real here though, even though this is pre-recorded, you feel like it's live. So we're moving on to comparing within one theme. So we kind of hopefully have considered these questions about who, what, when, where, why throughout our analysis, and in mix with those different patterns and the details and codes, big picture, small picture, everything. Here we want to start really getting into that. Where do we see the presence of an association between two categories? So for example, when we're talking about project success, what are some associations? What tends to come together and lead to project success? Or maybe where's there an absence between different categories? Or maybe do we have groups of, so we've asked who, right? Do we have groups where themes are expressed differently? Do NGOs understand trust in a different way than government agencies do? Are there different time scales involved? Things like that. Where are associations in that theme? And then we can move on to this stage of relating. And that's when we bring it to this kind of way bigger picture where we start making relationships across themes or connections among them. So again, kind of what conditions lead to blank, or What results when blank and blank come together? Typically this leads to, or whatever the case may be. What conditions cause a category to exist? So moving from just basically describing the themes that you're seeing, picking them apart within themes, understanding the nuances and complexities within them, and then looking at all your larger themes and how they relate together, kind of this upside down pyramid of expanding the way you discuss your data and present it in a convincing way. And as with all research, you want to talk about the implications of your study. So why do we care? Why does this matter? What is the meaning of this? Will it increase our knowledge? If so, how? Why is it important? What will we do with that knowledge? How does this contribute to theory? How does it change what we thought previously? How could this change the way that land managers act or the way that we provide education for local people? What is the importance of it? So kind of connecting all these little dots that you've collected throughout this intensive research process to actually present us with this very final product in a clear way. Remember that you have so much information and you need to concisely boil it down to a clear picture. I'm sorry, I don't know why it keeps double clicking the words there. Okay, and then application. So we want all of our research to be actually relevant and useful to people on the ground. We don't want it to just collect dust as knowledge collected, but without on the ground use. So luckily with qualitative research, it's hard, could be pretty hard to create information that's not useful in some way. For the most part, you're dealing with these really small, relatively small sample sizes at very specific context, a very specific study sample or environment. So you're going to come out then with very rich amount of information about that context, and whoever is operating in it is probably going to have some sort of a use for it. Maybe it's going to influence policy or different programs that are created, or methods of operation within a company. Who knows? Ideally, though, we shouldn't make that assumption that just because we come up with very rich, insightful, contextual information that it's automatically going to be used. Of course, as a reminder, we want to have that stakeholder buy-in from the very beginning of our research. Make sure that we're asking questions and finding answers that are actually wanted, that are going to be useful. And hopefully those stakeholders would have also given us some sort of an idea of exactly what they seek from this information so that we can make sure that we are providing it in that qualitative form. And in this kind of also the transfer value of the results. So yes, you've dealt with this very contextualized sample. Let's say 50 people, you have a rich understanding of that study group, or you can't, again, maybe make these statistically generalizable conclusions, but you should have some sort of transfer value beyond just the group that you studied. So that could contribute to like understanding of typical, maybe you study one community's relationship to a national park. You can't generalize to all communities, but there should be some points of that you can pull out and transfer to understanding of other similar cases or situations or demographics. And a really, I think, engaging, fulfilling part of applying qualitative research is that you, as the researcher, have so much information at this point that you are automatically considered an expert in your topic, which you could say for a survey as well. You have a lot of information, but only it's very structured. It's limited information. Not to say that it's not as valuable, but it's very different, because remember how immersed you've been if you've been doing interviews as your qualitative data collection process. You've maybe been in these people's homes, you've spent time with them, you've maybe met them multiple times, you listened to their life stories, you've listened to their experiences, and then you did that 100 times over, essentially, when you transcribe their interviews, or when you go through that coding process over and over and over again, and you've checked back with them to see if they agree with your interpretation. There's so much deep interaction with your data and with the phenomenon, the situation that you're studying, that you've come out with so much information. So really embody that, feel empowered by that, and take that ability and use it to share these results with people or institutions who are going to find it useful. That might look like, yes, hopefully, of course, sending them some sort of a summary written report, but also remember that that report there's no way it's going to cover all of the information that you've learned throughout this process. So I would recommend to be willing to meet with people in person and actually discuss those results and share with them some of the extensive wealth of insight that you now have to your study topic. And I think that's also, that is the conclusion of session 10. Just some very, again, basics about how to go about analyzing, writing, and sharing your qualitative results so that it can be rigorous, most useful, and relevant to the conservation challenges that we are trying to solve. So moving on from here, our very last session will be about your implementation plan. So having learned all of this information so much, again, some of it you already knew, hopefully you've learned some new things. Now that we have all this, how are we actually going to plan to put our research design process into work? What does that actually look like, getting it up and running and on the ground? So I look forward to not seeing you during that session 11, but following up with you and seeing where you end up afterward. Thank you. See you soon.